What do you mean on my screen?
Hello, everyone. I was saying, so Jenesis and Kim are both here. They are going to be our presenters for liberatory relationships. So excited to have them present on that for our webinar today. And before we have them dive in too much, I'll be letting people in and waiting for folks to join us as they arrive. But in the meantime, I want to give you some information about some upcoming OWHE education events and opportunities that you may have. Jenesis, would you mind going to the next slide?
Sure thing.
Perfect. So I always encourage you to watch the webinars we have and propose a webinar if you have something that you would like to share with the community. We are still currently have spots for webinars this summer as well as one in October. So if it is something that you would like to offer the group or be interested in doing, please let me know. You can reach out to me directly, or we also have a form on the OWHE website that you can go to in order to kind of submit a proposal for what you want to present on. And then on April 14th, me, Alex Aldrich, and Erica Curry will all be presenting on how to create a great webinar. This webinar is going to include tips on how to translate an in-person presentation into a webinar, as well as how to just create a good webinar in general. So I encourage you to go to that. That would be a great opportunity, especially if you are considering proposing a webinar, but you don't have experience in that area. It's a great place to start. So you can register for that through our website now. And then we also have opportunities to write for OWHE on our OWHE blog. So again, if you want to do that, there's suggestions of different types of blog posts that you can do, and you can send me an email or submit a proposal for that. And then we have a book discussion as a part of our learning community focused on Indigenous experiences. And so the next book that we're reading is There by Tommy Orange, and we have a discussion set up for April 22nd, so I encourage you to join us for that. And then lastly, if you have any interest in joining the OWHE board, I highly encourage you to do so. It's been a highlight of my last year being able to serve with these really awesome folks. So if you have any interest in that, the elections are still open. They'll be closing on March 13th, so I encourage you to go ahead and do that. If you're even thinking about it, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So you're welcome to reach out to me. And then I'll ask that make sure you keep yourself muted, but if you do have questions throughout, there'll be points where you can potentially share them auditorially, or you can always type them into the chat as well. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to our presenters.
Thanks so much, Shannon. Jenesis and I are really excited to be able to share our work with you all. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to spending the next little bit of time with you. My name is Kim McAloney. I work at Oregon State University in our Educational Opportunities program, and I've been there for about 6 years now. Yeah, my colleague Jenesis, she'll introduce herself a little bit more in just a second. So we're talking today about liberatory relationships and our research that we've done about liberatory relationships. We have some reflection embedded into our session. So if you were at the keynote for OWHE or know Jenesis and I at all, reflection is a big part of a big part of our practice. And so we have that included in today's webinar. So we have a handout for you, which is getting dropped into the chat right now. Please feel free to download that as we're getting started and talking about our time together. So that way you'll be able to see those questions. And then we're hoping they have some sort of way to reflect. So pen and paper, or maybe an email, an opened email, or a document that you can take some reflection time throughout. And we also have a couple moments where we'll be asking questions and we can engage, like Shannon said, you can engage through unmuting yourself or through the chat for those as well.
Awesome, thanks Kim. So hi everyone, my name is Jenesis Long, And I am Oregon State's Undergraduate Student Success and Advising Experience Coordinator. I had to read it because it's a really long title. But I've been in that role for the last 3 weeks. Previously, I worked in a program called MAPS, and it was where we served first generation and Pell eligible students, a single cohort in a research study. And then before that, academic advising for undecided students at OSU. And I've been working with Kim for quite a while, as we'll explain throughout this presentation. So I'm really thankful to be able to share this topic with you all, because it's kind of a culmination of a lot of different pieces. So today what we're going to talk with you about is first just making sure you all have access to our handout. I did drop the link in the chat, and you should be able to either download it or make a copy of it into your own Google Drive, but let us know if you have any issues with that or any tech issues around sound. Just let us know in the chat as we go. And then we're going to encourage you to reflect, as Kim mentioned. So we're really going to focus on mentorship and explain a bit about what we mean by liberatory relationships, or liberationships, as we've come to create recently. We'll talk about the research project that we've engaged in over the last 2 years. I think it's 2 years now, yeah.
Yes.
And the model that came from that research study, how that worked. And then again, we're going to open up for some group discussion, and hopefully you'll be able to end this presentation with a clear action item. We would love to hear your reflections at the end of what are you taking from this and how are you going to apply it to your work. So we'll make sure that there's some space at the end for you to do that work during this time, right? Because we can learn a lot, go off and maybe not revisit it. So we want to make sure that we end with enough time for that today. So let's roll into the next slide here. Cool. Okay. So to get started, we wanted to model just some sharing about what our experience has been like with mentorship. So personally, I actually experienced my first mentorship relationship way back when in like Girl Scouts as a little kid, just reflecting on how far back I've had strong role models and experiencing different types of mentorship. So that was one experience. And then again, I started working at a credit union in small town Brookings, Oregon. If anyone's familiar with that town, super rural, super small. And I was mentored by my colleagues and my boss at the time, learned some really interesting ways of being, was taught how to be a teller, how to be a professional. And so that was one experience with mentorship. And then I actually met Kim, who was my next mentor, through the NUF program, which is NASPA's Undergraduate Fellows Program. And that was through Oregon State, and its purpose is to serve historically underrepresented and marginalized groups in their exploration of higher education. And so I was an undergraduate student interested in student affairs while I was getting my psychology degree at Oregon State. And Kim became my mentor through that program. And then I went on to get my Master's of Ed through the College Student Services Administration program at OSU. And at that time is when Janet Nishihara became my major advisor for CSSA, but Kim was on my board as well. And so we'll explain a bit about the length of time and how we figured out it's like 25 years in a second. But I want to just detail that this mentorship word looked so differently for me in all of these different relationships. And yet I was continuing to find that the relationship I had with Kim and the conversations I could have with her and Janet were very different than some of the previous mentorship I had experienced. And so that's what really led us to this work. So I'll stop there and digress a bit so Kim can share with you about her experience with mentorship too.
Yeah, thank you, Genesis. I think similarly, I had some strong mentors growing up. And for me, that came through church and was really around like what it meant to be a woman and a wife and a future mom, right? So there's very sort of one sort of way of being the way I was supposed to be and how I was supposed to act and whatnot as I grew. And in coming to education, my first mentor in education was Larry Roper, who you see on this photo as well. And I also participated in the same program Genesis did, the NUF program, NASPA Undergraduate Fellows. fellows program, excuse me. And Larry was my mentor. And I think as I started that relationship with him, I really was getting this very different experience in terms of mentorship. And he was the vice provost for student affairs. So with my first gen, low income sort of background, like to have someone as my mentor who was at this sort of high level meant that like I talked with him about some stuff, but that was kind of it, right? And now the ways so there was that. Also, another mentor in the program at OWHE was Janet, who Jenesis mentioned a few minutes ago. And Janet was director of EOP. So it felt like, I was like, okay, it wasn't as scary as talking with the vice provost of student affairs. And as we started working together, I realized, so very similarly to what Jenesis was saying, I was engaging in conversations with Janet that was different. And when Jenesis came along and as we started working together, our conversations were different than other students I mentored in the program. So it was these moments where I think it was a Skype call or maybe a Zoom call 3 years ago. Janet, Jenesis, and I were all connecting, and we were talking about like there's the fact that there was something different with our relationships, and it'd be really interesting to explore that. So as we decided to, we kind of talked about that and had it just kind of there. And then the opportunity came up the next winter for us to engage in the mentorship itself. And so that's what we did, kind of really exploring our relationships and why they were different and what was it that was different about our relationships than other experiences that we've had with mentorship specifically. So as Jenesis said, we have 25 years of mentorship and relationships between all of us. So Janet and I have been in relationship since 2008. And Jenesis and I since 2012, right, is what we were talking about. And then Jenesis with Janet, and then all three of us, right? So we each have individual relationships with each other and a collective relationship as well. So lots of experience in working with one another, and in this sort of way that we've never worked with anyone else in these ways, right? So very different relationships with Janet and Jenesis than I do any other mentor that I've ever worked with, or mentees, right, that I've worked with. So we'll share a little bit now about the research. So we engaged in a duo ethnography where we came together 4 times around some very specific questions. And you'll see here on the screen are our 3 research questions. So we took these and broke them up into 4 sort of meetings and talking points. We met for an hour each of those virtually, and we spent the first few minutes together reflecting. So what's kind of our initial thoughts and reactions to our question for the day. We engaged in our conversation, and then we did reflection at the end. So we did 4 of those, and our last reflection was our reflection on our reflections, super meta, and thinking about what are the ways that our thinking changed from before we had conversation to afterwards, and the ways in which our relationships and this mentorship was impacting the ways in which we saw the world, and how we were bringing our whole selves to that, and how that was making a difference and an impact. So really kind of looking at, so as we look at these research questions, what was unique about our relationships, right? So we all began as this sort of student-faculty sort of hierarchy, but really, I think through our work together began that peer component or sort of mentorship, for lack of a better term, as we've been trying to name our experiences. Breaking down that hierarchy, right? And then within a few years, professionally, moving from student faculty to colleagues. So that was a question. The next question about what components of a relationship are mentorship. So there's lots of literature about mentorship and what mentorship is. And that term didn't quite fit for us anymore. We felt uncomfortable with that term. And so really wanted to explore why and what was different about our relationships that made them what we now use as liberationships as opposed to mentorships. And then how do we describe the changing and shifting dynamics within our relationships? So we found, as Jenesis, and I have gone from students to grad students, undergrad students to grad students to professionals, and lots of life things happening, partnerships and children and like all of those things, and we've maintained our relationships and what has shifted in our relationships through all of that. So that is a little bit more about our research.
And so like Kim mentioned, we went through this process and we were recording all of our engagements. And then afterwards we would code everything that we said. So we transcribed everything we said, and then we were looking for themes to try and figure out, is this mentorship, right? Is it not? Does it apply for only this situation, or are other people experiencing this, and how do we start conversations around it? And so what we ended up discovering was, what we created was this model. And so the way that this works, I'm just going to give an overview of it. So that bottom layer, that's kind of that lightish pink color, that stands for the who. So who are you, essentially? The three pieces that we discovered that were similar among us that made it possible for us to have this relationship was that we were able and comfortable to acknowledge systems of power. So we identified that we weren't individuals floating in the world, right? We were part of larger systems that were always at play. And we were able to acknowledge systems of power and oppression, and had the language to even do that, but then also the strength to be able to do that with one another. And we had shared identities that helped us to be able to understand each other's experiences. So whether that was in one moment, what was most salient was our identity as a woman of color, or being from a low-income background, or being a higher education professional. We had that overlap, and not all of our identities overlapped, but we had enough core identities that we were able to relate really well with each other. And we found that that was a really important part, because we were able to see our experiences in one another and process our experiences differently by learning from each other through that shared identity. And then the third piece there in that who layer is a desire for growth. And so that showed up in us being able to say, I'm trying this and it's not working. Do you have advice for me? Or I'm trying this new thing, but could I be trying more? And having that voice there from others to say, maybe you could be stretching in this way too. And so because we had that desire for growth, it really showed up in our relationships in being open to saying, I don't know all the answers, but I'm here and I trust you to give me feedback. Kim, do you have anything you want to add to that who layer description?
No, I don't. I think you got it really well. Thanks.
So then the next one is those bigger circles. So we've got the how layer. So we were thinking through the operationalization of these things. So we were talking about what moments in time do we remember in our relationships where things shifted. And so that showed up in reciprocity, which is being able to really give and take in our relationships and not have it be unidirectional, which is really similar in like most mentorship literature. There's the knower and then the learner, and there's not really any space for the mentor to be learning, or if there is, it's kind of informal. It's not necessarily like a priority, and it just happens to be like a one-off, oh cool, a dynamic, rather than really integral to the way that the relationship functioned. And part of that is related to resistance here. It's situated over that acknowledgement of power, because to acknowledge that power but then do something with it. So as we engaged in committee meetings together, or different work projects, or as Kim was my supervisor for a project, being able to distribute power amongst us was also an act of reciprocity, because we were sharing that power. Or being in a meeting and someone saying something, right, and then someone else being like saying the same thing, but not having heard that, like, for example, if Kim had said something and then someone else echoes it, but kind of didn't give her credit, right? Standing up and saying, hey, that's what Kim just said, right? Like when Kim said that, that was a great idea. And making sure that we're being seen, and that is part of resisting. We work at a predominantly white institution, so resisting those systems of power that are always at play together, and showing up in a way that acknowledges our whole selves and doesn't deny our needs in those conversations is really helpful to do when you have colleagues and supporters that get it and that are prioritizing these things as well. And then I'll add the third piece here, reflection. And so as we've said, reflection is integral to this process, because if we're in these relationships and we're not actively reflecting, it can be really hard if someone says, like, have you thought about this? And if you're closed off to that, you're probably going to be defensive, right? Or even acknowledging that you need support, it takes reflection first and being okay with what you need to then bring it to the relationship and seek that support of reciprocity and shared resistance. Other thoughts, Kim, you want to add to that description?
Yeah, just one quick piece. As Jenesis mentioned, we work at a predominantly white institution, and I think part of it also, this resistance piece, is showing up every day and being able to show up as our whole selves. And so, not just in our meeting spaces, but as we're meeting with students and as we're trying to answer email, right, or like respond to crises and what's happening, but that like we can bring our whole selves. And part of it for us, this resistance, is how do we help each other to show up as our whole selves every day, because the messages that we're getting is to not, right, that we need to conform, that we need to act in these sort of white supremacist sort of ways, and uphold professionalism and all of these other things, right, but also but not that we can show up as ourselves, bring all of who we are, which is resisting that system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And so the top layer here, that white piece, is why. And so this is what we discovered, and it's interesting. Why is essentially what is the outcome, right? So the outcomes that we identified were personal growth. So being able to really see where we started and where we are now, and witnessing how these relationships impacted that growth. And then also validation, so of our identities, of our goals, of our visions, of our beliefs as ourselves as people, which, coming from oppressed identities, is something that is necessary to stay engaged in work, in life, in large systems, in higher ed that was not set up for us, and being able to really find validation to be able to grow, then also leads into an increased work productivity. So because we have these dynamic relationships, we're able to get a lot done and be able to stack projects together. And because we have these relationships to lean on, we're able to then see too, where else could we be working? Where else could we be serving? And also managing that increased work productivity in a way that sustains us and is for the long term. And so if, for example, I might say, hey, Kim, I'm thinking about adding this to my plate, she can be like, okay, so tell me how that's going to fit into all the other things, right? Or where will that time go, right? To make sure that we're still being productive in our work, but it's not at the expense of our well-being. And then, actually, let me pause real quick. Anything else you want to add to that, Kim?
No, thanks.
Okay, so then the last piece is this big circle around the outside of the model that has little arrows in it. And so when I visualize this model, I'm actually picturing a 3D structure. It's kind of like all of these things are happening at once. And so that outside circle is to show that it's ever shifting, it's ever evolving. And part of what has been so dynamic about these relationships is that, as Kim mentioned, they've stayed strong and stayed important and valuable through so many different versions of ourselves and different stages of life. And so that's what that outer layer demonstrates as well. Any questions about the model here? I'm just going to pause for a second and see if anyone wants to chat a question or unmute and ask any questions about the model.
Or you could drop a question in the chat as well.
Looks like we're good. Maybe they're coming in. If you're typing, we'll address it here in a second. But one thing I wanted to add to this is that we created this model and we titled it Liberatory Mentorship for Women of Color, specifically because those are our identities. And then we started asking, does this work in other groups, for other groups? Does this work for people who identify as male? Does this work for different dynamics of power in their relationships too? And we had the opportunity to supervise 2 graduate students, and we encouraged them to learn this model with us and invited them to engage in this type of work with us, specifically making our supervision role more like mentorship. And we were able to validate that, yeah, it still works across different identities. And that was really exciting to see, and why we're leaning more towards the liberatory relationship dynamic. And part of it is that this is still new. We're still writing about it. We're actually currently working on a book chapter about this. So it's ever evolving, but I just wanted to add a quick note there about why that title showed up and how it's shifting and morphing over time.
Yeah, like that last piece that Jenesis was talking about, that circle around the model, right? This continual growth and development, like, is this happening right now?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Okay, so we're hoping to encourage you all to do some reflection and discussion with us as a group. So to get started with that, let me just show you these questions we have. So we also have your handout, and there's similar questions, but a little different. And so we were hoping to engage you all in a discussion around any of these questions that we have listed. So we are pretty flexible in terms of which ones we might gravitate towards. So if you could just take a moment and read through these questions. I'll kick us off with one around what is problematic about the term mentorship, if you have thoughts about that, but then we can go where the group wants to go as well. So I'm gonna wait a minute and see if anyone wants to start the group discussion, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm not seeing questions come through the chat. Let me see here. So if you'd like, you can unmute to share your response, or you can write it in the chat. It's your call, whichever you're comfortable with. We can read out from the chat, or you can just unmute your mic and then share your reflection. Looks like Raina, you might have something you'd like to share.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay.
Raina.
Hi. So problematic with the first question, I think for me is trying to get over that mentorship doesn't necessarily have to be a power difference. I think I always think of mentorship as supervisor type. That power structure needs to be in place to be a mentor. But I think seeing that differently, it's pretty surprising in how much mentorship has happened through my life as well. And it's not always that power structure that goes on. There's a lot of peer mentorship that goes on. So I think just looking at it more fully, as you both have described, is an interesting way of looking at it, and not a lot of people think of it that way. I think that's my perception. Yeah. Thanks for holding this. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And part of the research we did was looking at the literature around mentorship, and it really is very common to see like that to describe a mentor is to describe someone who understands something more so than the other person, and that it's kind of that one topic that they're going to talk about, and it's because that person understands that better than the mentee or the protege. That's really a common term in literature, and yet that really leaves out a lot of other relationships, right, that are mentoring and helping people grow. And that's part of what we're trying to do, is really add that nuance there. So thank you for that reflection.
One of the things that, and please others feel free to jump in. One of the things that have, we hear even in the group discussion of critical relationships, this sort of critical piece, I think has been really important for us, and sort of the liberatory piece, liberationships, and really being able to draw on liberatory pedagogies around, some of the folks who have really opened the door for us, mostly in classroom spaces, right? For faculty to develop sort of this way to engage in the classroom where it's a learning environment where we all can learn from one another. And so really taking that idea of this sort of reciprocal sort of learning that, for me as an official mentor of Jenesis with Nuff, like I had plenty, a ton to learn from Jenesis, in the ways that maybe there were some things I could offer her, right, in terms of this sort of profession and my experiences in our profession and the knowledge that I have. But there was a lot that I got to learn from her and continue to do. And so kind of pulling in those sort of critical pedagogies into the mentorship conversation.
Yeah, and I think that was really possible because we were able to bend some of those boundaries together and find, as we were discussing things, that as different topics came up, rather than just kind of breezing by it and being like, well, let's get back to work, we held space for, well, and how does that impact this other part of your life? And how are you processing that, and holding space for that reflection to be able to make those critical connections across our multiple identities and co-create what that space looked like, which I think kind of leads to that second question here of what areas do I focus on most when talking with my mentees. So if you've ever been a mentor, deciding the topics that you chat about during that mentorship time can be co-created, right? And it can be between the two of you. And partially, like in NUF, for example, or in CSSA, where Janet was my advisor, we had a clear focus, right? Like that brought us together. But it was in those peripheral conversations that we really were able to see the most growth and build the deeper connections that made these relationships so impactful long term. Did other people want to join in the group discussion?
So maybe as it seems like maybe people want to be more reflective at their time together. want you to maybe take a look at that handout that we had provided there in the link. If you don't have access to it, please let us know, but it should be right there in the chat. And take a look at the, maybe start with the who section. So reflect on some of your mentorship experiences and think about shared values that showed up in that space. What identities were present and salient in that space. So we'll give you maybe a couple minutes to kind of think back to your experiences and answer some of those questions, and particularly in light of this conversation, right? So in our research that we're bringing to the table, reflect back on your mentorship experiences.
And I put the link to the handout again in the chat for anyone who maybe didn't have that at first.
Thanks, Genesis. So we'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Okay, thank you for taking a couple minutes to reflect on your mentorship relationships. I think we'll head to kind of start to wrap this up and look at maybe, Genesis, would you mind changing the slide? Perfect, thank you. Thinking back to our conversation we've had over the last 40 minutes, in our sharing, in our model, all of those things, we're curious what takeaways you have from our conversation, from this session, what new knowledge maybe you have, or if there's pieces that maybe might be a different way of thinking or approaching a relationship you have, a mentorship that you are experiencing, or any of those components. So we'd love if folks would be willing to share maybe a takeaway.
Don't see any microphones going off. Let's see. We'll wait another minute or so and then see if people want to share. Maybe you're typing. Okay, so we've got Brenna here. I feel much more motivated to establish a formal mentorship relationship, which I never have before. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious about your use of formal mentorship relationship. I love hearing that because, yes, a mentorship relationship can be used so powerful, and describing what you're looking for is really important in that conversation. Thank you for sharing that. Kim, did you see that message show up in the chat?
I did, yeah. And Brenna, I think about, I think consider looking at the rest of the questions on the handout as you go to develop that relationship and sort of who you ask, and think about articulating, what is it that you're hoping for out of a relationship, and be able to engage in a conversation with someone as like, I'm looking for a mentor. Here's what I'm looking for. Would you be interested in being, this mentor for me? So kind of being able to be upfront from the beginning around what you're looking for, what you're hoping for, expectations, those sorts of things can really help make sure that you're both on a really solid sort of foundation, and your relationship can be built on that, those clear expectations. Thanks for sharing.
This is Suzanne. I just appreciate the worksheet that you provided, because I think it'll help me. I always think of oh, I should think about these things ahead of time and really go into my conversations, not so much super prepared and on point, but at least knowing, checking myself and remembering why these are important and how to think of those questions ahead of time, or conversation pieces ahead of time. So I'm looking at this worksheet and thinking how much value that is. I appreciate that and just wanted to say thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I can remember showing up to Kim's office with a list of what is this? How does that work? Have you ever experienced this? And then knowing that 3 or 4 questions, pointed topics, is good to, we usually could go an hour and a half off of that because we can really explore those boundaries and share those honest reflections. So I'm glad to hear that this was helpful and that the handout is something you're planning to use moving forward. That's awesome.
Are there reflections either shared by unmuting or in the chat?
Hi, this is Cindy Alexis at OSU. I was sitting here thinking through your questions, and I think establishing this mentorship relationship that then evolves into something even more, as the two of you have shared, having with each other as well as with Janet. I think that's a lot easier when it starts in a scholarly setting, where you have a professor type position that then provides mentorship to a student type position. I think it's a lot harder to establish these types of mentorship relationships when you're in a more professional environment. And if anybody has thoughts on how to move forward in those types of relationships or environments.
Yeah, I think that I know I've engaged in relationships that certainly have had some of these critical components that we're talking about. with colleagues. And I'm thinking about one relationship particularly with a specific colleague. And I think that they expressed to me that they saw me as a mentor, and I didn't know that. So it felt really awkward in that moment where, like, you're right, like, so my experience and based on the research I've done, right, around mentorship, I was like, how can we be in a mentorship relationship without talking about it, right? Was really interesting for me. But at that moment, like, after they shared this, like, we were able to engage in a deeper conversation about what learning from each other could look like in a more focused and intentional way. And so I think definitely different than experiences I've had with students that I've worked with both in and outside of the classroom, but was able to use many of these components in that relationship with my colleague. It just needed to have that initial conversation. And then we needed to open the lines of sort of some of the ways in which, having the dynamic of being a supervisor or a faculty member, we have these set times where we're going to be meeting, right? And so with that colleague, how are we going to set up to make sure that we were having specific time together to be able to learn from each other, and not just in our general staff meetings with everyone, but how could we make space to continue to get to know each other better, and find where are our commonalities and where can we educate one another, and to be able to get to a place, right, where we can support each other more so in that reflection, in the resistance pieces, and the reciprocity, right? So I think for me, I've had experiences in doing this with colleagues. It just takes really intentional conversations that are just look different if you're developing the classroom space or supervisory space, particularly with students. Others?
I was thinking about, I worked on a small team and we started setting up time for debriefs. And that was really helpful because that gave us space to essentially be mentoring each other on our jobs, because we did the same job and we were able to share, like, these were my challenges, these are my questions, what resources do you have? And so I don't know that we ever actually used the word mentorship in that space, but a lot of the same dynamics were at play because we were lifting each other up, right? We were liberating each other to do our work in more ideal ways together. And so I think that was one way that I really gained a lot of the same outcomes and through similar experiences that worked across folks that were at the same position as me. And then I'm thinking about a supervisor I had that I worked for a while, and I wanted more support. I wanted more feedback. I wanted more mentorship. And so we started having, I think it was at my annual review, I shared that I was seeking that and that I wanted that. And so we started setting up, I think it was bi-weekly check-in meetings where it was just open-ended, like, how are you questions, but also pointed support around what I was doing, where I was going, my professional development goals, resources, and that led to a lot of new opportunities. And so I would say just those two experiences both started with the ask of, can we have more intentional time together, like Kim was talking about, and just being kind of frank about it, that you want more from the relationship, and maybe giving an idea about what that could look like made it possible for us to get there. Did that help? Was that kind of related to your thought there, Cindy, or is there something else that we could address?
No, very helpful. Thank you both.
Awesome. Thanks.
Do other folks have thoughts about this question and or other takeaways or questions you have for us or the group?
Okay, so we are at about 12:50. So I know a lot of you are joining us on your lunch break, so we can wrap up. If you have any follow-ups, you can contact us, but we've got a couple slides here so you know. If you want to see our references from our research, you can, I think we're going to send these out afterwards, and there'll be a recording. So you can visit some of these resources if you're interested, but then also got our contact information here for any follow-ups after the call. We're happy to engage with you in one-on-one dialogue. At least I am. Sorry, I don't want to speak for you, Kim.
Me too.
Perfect. So feel free to contact us with follow-ups. Otherwise, thank you for being here and engaging with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for engaging the conversation and for engaging in the reflection as well.
And I would love to plug that with OWHE, we do have a mutual mentorship model, which can go well with a lot of the things that you were talking about. So I encourage you to look at engaging that way as well. So again, yeah, thank you, Kim and Jenesis, so much for sharing this and your perspective, especially as women of color in a very white organization. So again, thank you. And I will be sending out an email probably next week that will have a link to this video recorded on YouTube. So if you'd like to share it with anyone or rewatch anything, I'll also be sending out the handout with that as well, and an evaluation to give any feedback. So again, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Shannon. Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.